And I thought that late modernity itself became a form of apparitional modernity, um, not just to do with repetition, but also to do with a trace element of something which is not sort of necessarily repeated from an index. So it's not like a repeat of something before, but the elsewhere of something, something which is like a geist, a spirit, a trace, but without indexicality, without a root. So the key words for this study is ontology, ghosts, apparitions, otherness, shadows, phantoms, mourning, zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is the spirit of the time, and the gaze. So spectre comes from the Latin spectrum, meaning to look or to see, or from the French word spectra. The Greek word phantasma is also related to the meaning to make visible. So there's a certain sort of visibility, certain way of looking, but a looking without, I'd say, without indexicality, without a root meaning, something which occurs on the edge of vision, as it were. The main theorist of ontology is Jacques Derrida in his book Spectres of Marx. And again, it's this idea of something which repeats, but not as before. And he repeats the phrase from Hamlet, "The time is out of joint," in order to open out the connection between time and spectrality. Derrida evokes a way of learning how to live between life and death, and by living between the two to occupy a place of ghostless singularity, which resembles an emission. We could internalize this idea of emission with the unconscious, which for Lacan is seen as a form of unmeant knowledge that can't tolerate one's knowing that one knows. The image represents a paradox that suspends the relationship between knowing and seeing because it grows both the legible and the visible within the secured economies. This is why the image incorporates a negative force, which in turn can be grasped, a veritable vanishing point, cannot be grasped, a veritable vanishing point of knowledge. The non-graspability of the image is a force that sets aside or at a distance. Some of the ideas of spectrality, in fact, come from early modernism with Hegel, and he divided vision into daytime and what he called the night, darkness, or negation. Indeed, in a way, Hegel could be seen as one of the theorists who abstractly kind of starts to inaugurate a view of photography. This is time is out of joint, which is from Hamlet, but is repeated again and again in a lot of theorizations of late modernity or the contemporary time. So in this instance, the actor cannot identify himself totally with Hamlet because he is not known who he is. He must always remain partly himself, but also represent what he is not. This difference opens out the space of the fictional as if. So we have have a decentered notion of the subject, a subject that can never know him or herself fully, is always displaced into the negative, which takes the subject into a field of not knowing. And this distinction between the living and the dead has always been at the root of the thinking about the image. So in a sense, this going from Hegel, this idea of taking the light into darkness, into the night, and the night being the realm of the imagination and divided between a storehouse of images, a kind of the image is seen by Hegel as being the source of the unconscious, a kind of storehouse of images, which later on in Freud becomes psychological concept of the unconscious. So apparitions. I start with this painting by the Southern Song artist. This is from about the year late 12th, early 13th century. Liang Kai, boat, lying in the boat, playing the flute by the willow, Southern Song. So you can just see in the center, down in the middle of the painting, the center, there's just a very faint, almost apparitional image of the two figures boating. In this sort of almost trace element, this ghostly emission of a landscape, hardly any indexical route of what we'd call land and sky, or earth and sky. So already in this period, you get this sort of feeling of an encounter with reality, which is absorbed into the realm of a spirit or the elsewhere. It's the same artist, and again, you get this sort of feeling of the ink floating away from the ground. There's no feeling of a division between sky and earth. This is Chen Rogue, Nine Dragons from the 13th century. That's the Yuan period. The dragon is a specter, a kind of, it comes from below the sea or from the sky. It is imagined as a kind of relationship between a kind of energetics and spirit, sort of abstraction of forces which run through nature. To say this, a painting like this almost anticipates abstract expressionism in that it tries to get the underlying forces of nature, and there's kind of this veil of the relationship between invisible and visible and invisible. It's again Yuan period, kind of possession of ghosts and specters, and so in between the realm of the living and the dead, the ghost passes by, drawing upon each economy of the realm of the dead and the realm of the living. There's a fascinating series of drawings which are in the Topkapi Museum in Turkey, in Istanbul. They're from Central Asia, but they're mysterious. No one really knows the origins of these works, who they were done for, or what their purpose were. They between the ghostly and the monstrous. Really amazing. If you're ever in the Topkapi in Istanbul, they're worth hunting out. This is a woodblock print from the late 19th century Meiji period in Japan. But there's a whole genre of ghostly depiction. So you find it in film, literature, and visual arts. This is Goya. This is in the late 18th century. The sleep of reason produces monsters. So somehow there's a connection between monstrosity and ontology, or apparitional poetics. Again, you get this feeling of the sort of nighttime, this view of dream, which is spectral realm. The French painter, the realist painter Géricault, created a whole series of paintings of the insane in the attempt to capture maladies of the soul or haunting of the subject cast into the elsewhere. Again, this feeling of de-centered subject, of a kind of subject who's elsewhere to rationality, is what's captured in these incredible series of paintings of the insane and the criminals and the mad. View of the sort of emptiness of the self. There's a quote from Hegel: "Man is this night, this empty nothing, which holds everything in its simplicity, a kingdom of endless repetitions, images, and none of which appear immediately to him, or which are not immediately present. This is the night, nature's inner, which is here, exists, pure self, phantasmagorical representations are surrounded by the night. Here shoots out a bloody head. There another white figure suddenly comes forward and disappears just as suddenly. One captures the glimpse of the night when one looks in others in the eyes, into the night which would be frightful. Here hangs over one with the night of the world." This feeling of haunting is to do with this other realm, this, you could say, nighttime realm, where light doesn't emit consistency and rationality. There's a quote by Michel Foucault: "The madman sees the daytime the same daylight as the man of reason. Both live in the same brightness, but seeing this daylight and nothing but daylight, he sees it as a void, as a night, as nothing." This is obviously drawn from Hegel. This is the symbolist artist Gustave Moreau, The Apparition, from the late 19th century. His paintings at the same time as late Impressionism, a different visual economy, a kind of, again, a sort of nighttime visionary space as opposed to daylight and actuality and transparency, if you like. And following through the symbol is Odilon Redon, who opened out the continent of the unconscious, and with him this realm of the apparitional and the excessive. They call these noirs, but they easily could be seen as nighttime drawings, as spectral drawings, as bereft of the daylight, sort of visionary light, which picks out monsters and specters and apparitions. So the symbolists very much anticipated the coming of the unconscious. This is Odilon Redon again. This is called Black Sun, 1900. It's in pastels. This is the Atget, early photographic artist. The Paris changes, but in sadness like mine, nothing stirs. New buildings, old neighborhoods turn to allegory, and memories weigh even more than stone. One of the things about his photographs is they have this sort of ghostly feeling, as if it's depopulated. The sort of time-lapse photography immortalizes a stone, but erases the movement of spirits, and you get this feeling of incredible emptiness, and as if the end of the world has already occurred. In the book Benjamin's Ghost, the writer Gerhard Richter discusses Benjamin's unfinished book or project, the Arcades Project, which he believes is in many ways a ghost book. The idea that Paris as a city is haunted by ghosts has a history rooted in the 19th century writings of Baudelaire, Hugo, and passes into the 20th century with figures such as André Breton, whether discussing the promise and decay of Paris and the ideological patterns of the 19th century, whether circumscribing the ghostly origins or the procedures of photography. This is why old photography appears ghostly. The haunted nature of technological innovation, such as the telephone, street lightings, railway travel, or the cultural anachronisms of the Baudelairean flaneur and its metropolitan habitats. Benjamin's texts are populated by ghosts and phantasms. So again, this is following through with the idea of a city that doesn't repeats itself, is inhabited itself, but as a ghostly afterlife, as a spectre, not as a progression, not as a modernization project, as something which isn't kind of sense of a trap dirt, if you like, kind of something which never gets the air never gets clean. These specters. The quote by Benjamin. Everyone knows from dreams the horror of doors which will not close. More precisely, they are doors which seem locked without being so. In an intensified way, I made acquaintance with this phenomenon in a dream in which I, accompanied by a friend, encountered a ghost in the window of the first floor of a house to our right. As we proceeded, it accompanied us through the interior of all houses. It walked through walls, always keeping in line abreast with us. I saw this even though I was blind. The stroll we take through the arcades is basically to such a ghostly path in which doors give way and the walls move. So in his study of the Arcades Project, he not only meditates on the idea of the ghostly remains of the modernist project, but also on photographers such as Zach Gay. The modernity of the 20th century can be said to be transformed by what Acquera Lippert describes as the three phenomenologies of the inside, which were each established in 1895. I mean, those dates are not completely accurate. That is the X-rays, cinema, and psychoanalysis. So these three technologies of what he calls the inside, X-rays, cinema, psychoanalysis. He terms this the haunting of the inside, and this shifts not only the imagining of interiority, but transforms the condition of visuality. They transform the structures of visual perception, shifting the terms of the vision from phenomenal to phasmatic registers, from the perceived visuality to imagined one, from the visual to the avisual. Again, a before a word is always not visual. That's a really interesting demarcation of between the late symbolist moment and beginnings of the 20th century. A kind of distinct new economy of the relation of inside and outside. And that in part explains the shift away from the mimetic. Mimetic is the resemblance of appearances, or the reproduction of presence. It's a shift towards absence and to hauntology. This is Freud, but Derrida speaking about Freud in the book Archive Fever. It is known that Freud did everything possible not to neglect the experience of hauntings, spectrality, phantoms, ghosts. He tried to account for them courageously in scientific, critical, and positive a fashion as possible. But in doing that, he tried to conjure them. Like Marx, his scientific positivism was put to the service of declared hauntedness out of his own unavowed fear. So a sense of which positivism, which is a kind of sense of something being known in advance, something being able to be predictable, secure, is undermined by something which acts as a counterweight, a sort of absence of predictability and a visual secureness. With this, we get the feeling, the sense of the return of something repressed. So again, at the turn of the century, we don't get a turn towards necessarily the complete optimism within technological development, a kind of sense of the cleansing of the world. It kind of this also brings about the return of the repressed. So following from Benjamin's observations about Paris in the 19th century, we get Andre Breton writing a book called Nausea. And in the book, he says, "Who am I? If this were once to reply on a proverb, then perhaps everything would amount to knowing who I haunt." So a kind of inversion of I think, therefore am, a sort of clarity of knowing, space of, surrealism being partly to do with the return of the press, but also to do with hauntology. A wonderful book. It's not the genre of it. It's half a ghost story and half a book about desire and walking through the city in confrontation with monuments and relics and getting lost to find one's way and chasing something which is there or not there. This sort of uncertainty principle of knowing. This is de Chirico. Again, this world in which the daylight and the nighttime, the economies of both mix. You get long shadows. You can only come with the sun, but you equally get the nighttime sky. There's Max Ernst's graphic novels, which use 19th century illustrations to collage a new reality. So again, it's this return of the 19th century into the economy of the 20th century and to reoccasion the sense of a world of otherness, of strangeness, of monstrosities and fusions between the worlds of animals and humans and birds. And this Dorothy Tanning, surrealist artist, was called Birthday. Again, you get this mystery of doors that open to other doors, to a kind of recessional space, which there's no distinct inside or outside. It's kind of a space which is completely irrational but fascinating. This is a work by Man Ray from 22. It's clear in Man Ray's work there's a kind of fascination with this meeting point between visual economies of the night and of the day, and a kind of experiment to do with light and to do with focus and to do with superimposition and solarization. So he explored this process of photography to its technical limit, exposing the process, the fragile limit between reality and the spectral. That's the self-portrait. So this is experimented with superimpositions and light forms and negatives and positives. Came up with this process of solarization. Again from 1930, print of a negative. This is Mogen Cunningham, Man Ray versus version Man Ray, 61. The uncanny or unhomely, unheimlich. Freud's The Uncanny is an essay which investigates the realm of darkness, saying the uncanny would always, as it were, be something what one does not know one's way about in, yet it is not the pure realm of darkness that is a concern, but rather what is revealed and brought to light. Paul de Man defined the uncanny as to make the invisible visible. Darkness is uncanny because it is a site of ghostly emission. Freud also evokes the fear of blindness and the fear of being buried alive, both of which are other forms of loss that might be figured as being connected to the night. Derrida evokes the idea of the relationship between the night and the idea of difficult writing or research which is not submitted to the norms of culture, is excluded from the scene, occulted, deprived of the day of the light. So very much these figures of thought come from Hegel in the early 19th century, where the idea of the unconscious surfaces with figures like Schelling in relationship to nature, or Hegel in the relationship to the imagination. It's Claude Cahun, What Do You Want of Me, from 28. Again, this sort of idea of surrealism has been based upon an apparitional sense of not just dreams, but of decentedness of the subject, a subject that doesn't know who he or she is, who can't see the other with the self-same eyes. This is a tiny work, but one which comes to be reoccasioned in the late 20th century as an exemplary study of the subject, split subject, divided subject. This is a mask from Zaire, multiple heads, as a way of conceiving of the subject as being existing in different realms: the spirit realm, the everyday, the aesthetic realm. Sometimes you get figures with masks with double eyes, which were worn by the figures who are responsible for guiding the passage from the realm of the everyday to the spirit realm, clairvoyance, and such figures will have a great influence upon surrealist imagination. So again, Derrida, psychoanalysis has taught us that the dead, or a dead parent, for example, can be more alive for us, more powerful, more scary than the living. It's a question of ghosts. It's the late Picasso drawing. It's halfway between living and the dead. Evoked for me this quote from Alexander Kojève, who did these lectures on Hegel in Paris before the Second World War and just after the Second World War. Man is death who lives a human life. This is Francis Bacon, The Death Mask of William Blake. In the exhibition at the Royal Academy, you'll see paintings where it tend to be in his earlier work where there's shadows with figures half emerging from them, kind of uncertain whether they just shadow or whether they figure. We can't see her seeing and thus experience this as a gap. Perhaps the image comes before us, but also after us, and as such has a double relationship, has a double relation as image, which can be described as haunting. I remember seeing this image for the first time. I was at school on the front page of, I think it was the Sunday Times magazine. It never left me, this feeling of a gesture which is blinded gesture, a kind of hopeless, the last grasp of being human, to hold the hand up to cover the bandaged face. Philip Guston, Head and Bottle from 75. These heads that he produced, detached from bodies or in piles, or talk about a culture which is bereft of order and gone into a nighttime world where the naked light bulb illuminates a head without a mouth, without a body. Is looking at a bottle which would be impossible to see at such a close distance. It's as if object and subject had kind of completely become one together. The shadow is a shadow of red, which is it indicates the opposite of a shadow. It could be a blood trace. There's Joseph Beuys, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hair from 75. So as Greenbergian formalism broke up, we start to get in art this disturbed, this return to the image, to the potency of the image. But after these clean, color-filled paintings, abstract paintings with hardly any texture, hardly any emotion, suddenly we get these dense images of foreboding and dread and sort of visual density and irrationality, a kind of unexplainable force harnessed for a performative sense of an ending or of rupture or striation of the culture. There's a period in which there's great disturbance in the economic order of things. Inflation went up to about over 20%. The economy was on the edge of collapse. Perhaps a period we can learn from now, because we're entering into, likewise, a period of, after a long period of neoliberal economics in which the money supply was held in check to retain very low interest rates and low inflation. We're going to the opposite now. High inflation, high taxation, social disturbance is the norm. And it's not just that, it's built upon a kind of a sense which we're very much again haunted by possession of the dead, in which there was no symbolic structure for them to be properly socially buried, or to the idea of thousands of people dying without symbolic economy is a disturbance within the culture. It's Boltanski, Christian Boltanski. He did these works which, again, based on the procession of the dead, the Holocaust victims, or in particular. So these memorials, these sort of process of memorialization, but the sort of kind of light, a kind of shadowy light, illuminating these faded figures. This is Theatre of Shadows from 1984. Very simple work, kind of just single illumination in the center of these cut out figures projecting the images of shadows on the wall. This is first shown in England in the ICA upstairs. This is a photograph by Salgado, started in Mexico in 1980. The dog almost waiting for his owner to return from the dead. This is a still from a film by Ken McMullen called Ghost Dance, which he did in collaboration with Jacques Derrida. I've got a short passage of Derrida in the film, show afterwards. I won't read all of this, but one of the great ghost films called the Getsu Monogatari from 1953 by Mizoguchi. It's about a country potter who meets a lady called Wataza, who wishes to purchase his pots. He goes to the mansion and is escorted to the candlelight living space, and he doesn't know that he's entered the realm of the ghosts. So she's from an earlier period. If he'd have known the codes of makeup of the earlier period, he wouldn't have been fooled, but he falls in love with her, or they seduce each other, or she just seduces him, and he escapes the realm of the ghostly realm by a priest writing inscriptions on his back to ward off the spirits. And when he returns to the mansion, it's not there. It's just a ruin. But it's set in the wartime period in Japan, in the Maruyama period. It's a wonderful film. I'd recommend you looking at it. Another film, which this is by Michelangelo Antonioni, called Blow Up from '66, which was his film on, he came to London to make a film. It's very much based upon the image of David Bailey, the most visible photographer of that period. But it's about a photographer who is just a fashion photographer who goes out and into the park to take photographs, and he doesn't know what he's shooting, and he goes to the dark room and he sees something strange, and he sees a couple, and the face of the woman alerts him to the fact that there's something in the undergrowth, and he tries to blow up and blow up and blow up to find, is it a dead body or is it a figure with a gun, or it's not answered in the film. Again, I've got a short passage from this film. It's very much about being spooked. Spook is a term which is employed for a spy, but also to be spooked is also being affected by a spectral event. So we say that spooked me out. But spook is also a spy. In both cases, it's difficult to detect. So it's a form of uncanny or being looked at from a placeless place. So he's spooked by a shadow of something which he can't interpret or can't quite clarify. Double Life. In the film Double Life of Veronique by Kolosky, two women born at the same time, seemingly identical, both live with the sensation of missing someone. We get this idea of the double. And in the past, we looked at a short passage from this film. This is a film by the Coen brothers, a still from The Man Who Wasn't There. It's a marvelous film. It's about a barber who's completely alienated. He just says, it's a job I do, but I don't really feel that I'm at home with this. I'm just a barber, he says. And he sees himself as being a ghost. And he's actually, in the end, is put to electric chair for a murder that he doesn't commit, even though he's committed another murder. So he accepts his sentence. So it's like a double. It's like a double character. He's both someone who inhabits a social world, but is also displaced from that world, and comes apart. Is found guilty of something he doesn't commit, but accepts his verdict because he's already has a sense of guilt. So just a section I call the Poetics of Spectrality. This is Novalis, the Jaina romantic, both a poet and a philosopher. There are no good where there are no gods, spectres rule. So already this idea of the death of God gives way to this idea of spectrality. Memory is not an instrument for exploring the past, but it's theatre. It is a medium for past experiences. The ground is a medium for in which dead cities lie interned. Walter Benjamin. Benjamin did a study of German Romanticism for his doctorate. So very much was obsessed by the ideas like of Hölderlin and Novalis, a kind of way of writing which is concerned with allegory and aphorism. Very much a melancholic figure who never kind of quite overcomes sense of burden of the past. Committed suicide in 1940 at the border of Spain and France, trying to escape the Nazis. And his brother died in a concentration camp. This is Kafka, and Benjamin did a study on an essay on Kafka. When we are awake, we go through a dream where the ghosts of past time. So again, with early maternity, you get not just the return of the repressed, but a kind of relationship to time passing. So you get, this is the preoccupation with Proust and Kafka. How to account for past time. This is the same with Benjamin as well. He's concerned with recollection, a process of restoring the past to kind of almost as a way of trying to resurrect the future as a possibility. This is Maurice Blanchot. At first sight, the image does not resemble a cadaver, but it could be the strangeness of the cadaver is also the strangeness of the image. The sense of the image being doubled, having a dual life of both absence and presence. In fact, the image is on the side of, comes from the imaginary, and which is the realm of absence and the elsewhere of reason, and intersects the night, the darkness of the night and the light of the day. Again, on this preoccupation with temporality, it's Borges. Time is a substance from which I am made. Time is a river which carries me along, but I am the river. It is the tiger that devours me, but I am the tiger. It is the fire that consumes me, but I am the fire. It's labyrinths of sense of later in his life he went blind, so this is an image of him as his blind state. Antoine Artaud wrote Theatre of Cruelty, one of the most influential texts on theatre. So this idea of a theatre of gestures rather than of language. But he was haunted by the extreme limit of the outside. So he passed over into madness. He was in the insane asylum where he did these incredible notebooks and drawings. Very diagrammatic. He would write poems and draw faces and diagrams. This is a still from recording of the play Not I by Samuel Beckett, which is just a mouth reciting a kind of poetic flow of consciousness. again, the idea of not I is the displacement of the subject reduced to being just visually a mouth, no eyes, no ears, just a mouth in black space. This Derrida spectres of Marx. So this developed this idea of the persistence of or return of elements from the past assert themselves in the manner of a ghost. So his theorization of Marx is that Marx returns not as a revolutionary, but as a kind of haunted figure who no longer can find his way out of the figures that he created in the first place, as they become doubled over. This is also in turn you find in Zizek's book on the sublime object of ideology. He takes Freud's dream work and Marx's theory of value with Kant's theory of the sublime, and he very much comes with the idea that there's no root meaning to, there's no value within value, there's no meaning within dreams, and there's no absolute otherness within the sublime of Kant. Derrida. This is cinema is the art of allowing ghosts to come back. If it, learning to live, remains to be done, it can happen only between life and death, neither in life or death alone. What happens between the two, between all of the two, is one light, such as between life and death, can only maintain itself with some ghost, can only talk with or about some ghost. So the spectrality of the ghost, Derrida adds, is what exceeds and thus deconstructs all ontological oppositions, being and nothingness, life and death. It can give and can pardon and give pardon. And a close associate of Derrida, who's written books with Derrida, Helen Sassou. Everything remains to be said about the subject of the ghost and the ambiguity of the return, for what renders it intolerable is not so much that it is an announcement of death or even a proof that death exists, since the ghost announced and proves nothing more than his return. What is intolerable is the ghost erases the limit which exists between two states, neither life or death, passes through. The dead man returns in the manner of the repressed. It is coming back which makes the ghost what he is, just as the return of the repressed is what inscribes repression. In the end, death is never anything more than the disturbance of the limits. The impossible is to die. The book by Toni Morrison, Beloved, she explores the story of Seth, who killed a baby called Beloved in order to prevent her from knowing the horrors of slavery. The baby's ghost haunts Seth and threatens to consume her. The book is inspired by a story of an enslaved woman called Margaret Garner who committed infanticide. And finally, photography and spectrality. In every photograph, there are spectres. What survives or lives on in the photograph, thanks to the photographic process, is the survival of the dead or of ghosts. And one of the main genres which inaugurates the photographic as a discourse is spirit photography, which developed in the mid-19th century and became closely associated with the evolution of it as a medium. Francesca Woodman. I show you what you do not see, the body's inner forces. Am I in the picture? Am I getting in or out of it? I could be a ghost, an animal, or a dead body, not just this girl standing on the corner. Work from the Angel series. On the edge of disappearing or fading out, repeating this again and again until disappearing from the life itself. She took her own life, as if the image took her to this place where she only knew how to disappear. Joel Peter Whitkin's photographs represent a human afterworld in which photography is inherently occult. So on The Kiss from 1982, it's the single head severed in half and rephotographed in intimate embrace that makes an impossible sense of image.
He makes some like grotesque things.
The monstrous is simply not simply grotesque, aberrant, or deviant, a strange, misshapen anomaly, but also a prodigious figure, marvelous beyond belief, excessive, unrestrained, extraordinary. Work by Dedo Maruyama, Imitation from 95. This screen, this anti-world in the world, produces images without referring them to some original form without matter. The image maintains only a ghostly reality, completely spiritualized. So this idea of the world in which there's no longer any index, this sort of virtual world in which images, and onwards without any original ever being restored and put in place or archived. A part of this dematerialization and this anti-world is you can't believe anything you hear, you can't believe in what you see. So there used to be expression seeing as believing, which is now such an obsolete term. Turn to Japanese culture, the Buto performer.
I think it's because
Yeah, a Buto performance artist. There's an image of Daruma projected onto the body.
yeah, I'm just gonna and I've got four things to spread. 20 minutes, please.
Sokusai, sort of ghost image. As I was saying earlier on, it's the whole genre. Like on the level of courtesans or samurai or School of Okusai, female ghost in the moonlight. So Buto dance performance often portray a space where the life appears to touch the realm of the dead, either apparitional or diseased body as a medium of expression. This is the photographer Ueda, the lead dancer of Sankai Juko. Again, the same photographer in an ancient forest in Japan. Again, Ueda, portrait of Miles Davis. This is a self-portrait by Hiroshi Sugimoto. To me, photography functions as a fossilization of time. He became famous for these seascapes, which could be before history or post-history. But certainly there's an erasure of all human presence, of all life forms. Almost the horizon of history is disappearing into the vaporous beyond. He did these photographic studies of architecture. These are the Twin Towers. This is a kind of image of them being schematized before they exist. Paradoxically, they were erased. So this is before and after kind of reality to these photographs. The German artist Daniel Gustav Kramer, a work called Woodland. The forest stands in its indifference to the gaze and as such basks in its own impenetrability. It is as a surface, a covering, but also a void without defined edge. It gives over to the apparitional. It is a place to be stalked by it, by the other, or a place to assume disguises. As a flux, it stretches and moves, becomes a form that's some way also is elsewhere from it. We begin to think of the forest as a realm that gives over to the modes of darkness. It offers a promise in pathways and openings, splendor in the shafts of light that penetrate downwards. The soft of the underneath might comfort, and yet we're in the grip of an encroaching strangulation of passage. Vision is secured by it, and in this we conceive of imagined figure or even a force. In such a space we might imagine ways in which sounds connect to vision, and in doing so creates an oscillation of the perceptual field. He often talked about when he took photographs in a forest, he'd lose himself for hours. And then perhaps just the sound of a twig breaking would alert him to the visual. And he'd take a photograph. So there's a switching of attention. It wasn't just primarily a visual meditation on appearance. It was a kind of apprehension of something other, some other reality penetrating into an innocent sense of spectacle. So the Japanese photographer Akiko Takazuari, Shadows on the Hill. I saw the work as being capturing this wavering between the finite and infinite. And that this idea of wavering is an essential feature of the identity itself, this constant wavering of the imagination is implicit in her work. It captures emotion not only between the real and the spectral, but also between being and subtraction or non-being. It would be an obvious form of recognition to say these images are invariably touched or even saturated by darkness, and from there talk of a shadow or even spectral aesthetics. All of this would indicate a withdrawal from the concerns of the day. This is a photograph by Philip Lorca de Corsia. And just a few final thoughts and images. Harold Rosenberg, the art critic, said that Pollock became a ghost inhabiting the art world. Paintings by the artist George Shaw. Painted these everyday scenes on the edge of cities like Coventry. The spaces in which you have this feeling of the uncanny or something dark appearing. Certainly abject images. There's a Chinese artist, Liang Zhang, Butterfly Dream. These are works she did as a student at the RCA. Finally, the work of Zhu Holtier from 2019. Holtier, a figure is cast double. The tonal poetics derived from the night that never quite arrives. The space between the two is measured to the point of aloof distance, but then they are not apart because they appear to be the self-same. It is double an outcome of spectrality. Hands held behind the back, faces turned away, light touching the nerve of the withdrawal point towards a deeper mode of displaced presence. It is a dark painting, both on the level of tone and mood, but it is also a painting issuing out of a compelling lightness of touch, a fold of tone and touch. This is what we're given over to, the art of tone and touch, evading common sense. Evasive, it simply goes on. Finally, just one or two last slides. This is Mark Leckey, Dream of English Kid, 64 to 99. These urban spaces, again, like George Shaw, these abject spaces between motorways and derelict urban spaces, which are ugly and become places of graffiti and skateboarding and drug taking, even. And finally, quote from Jean-Luc Nancy, who died last year. From one moment to the next, we find ourselves sensibly and physically outside of ourselves, outside of the blind slipping away of our little stretch of time. We see the night that borders on our time, and we touch some aspect of it, not the future, but the coming of something or someone, the coming of something that's already of us in the world, that has come from somewhere else, displaced elsewhere into the unimaginable elsewhere. Those are just some references. Questions, thoughts?
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you very, very much for that. How would you compare, let's say, somebody like Derrida with the surrealists and their view of the spectral? I know you touched on it a little bit earlier on.
I think it passes through several distinct phases. I think that Derrida is very strongly influenced by Hegel. In turn, the surrealists were influenced by Hegelian Marxism. So I think there's a sort of series of connections which exist between Hegel, the surrealists, and Derrida. But it's not direct lines; they're curved lines. And also Freud, obviously. So there's a line which goes from Hegel to Freud to the surrealist or through the symbolist to the surrealist to Freud to Derrida and so on. But I think it's Hegel's writing on the night that is particularly striking, that runs through it, and the kind of return of the figures like Return of the Repressed. And so you could say that there's a counter-rhythmical modernity which runs from Romanticism, Jaina Romanticism, through to symbolism, through to surrealism, and through to some elements of late modernism. So it's not a modernity of rationality, or it's a transgressive modernity. So the idea in Derrida's Spectres of Marx is very much to do with the return of figures of modernity, but not a repetition of modernity. And it's to do with a sort of resistance to the metaphysics of presence and the dualism of the subject and object. So it's a kind of looking for a figure that abolishes the in-between. I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. And well, in the absence of other people chipping in until I get warmed up, you touched on somewhere, and I can't remember it exactly, but something like imagination was between, like the present and the infinite, or something along those lines.
The idea of imagination being the wavering of the infinite and the finite.
Oh, that's it. Yes.
That you find that in Schelling and Fichte, the idealists, just at the time of the Jaina Romanticism, just after the turn of the century. You get this idea of the unconscious in Shelley as a sort of aspect of nature, having an unconscious, and you get it in Hegel to do with the imagination.
And I guess Jean-Luc Nancy as well borrows that on the sublime, or the hovering on the edge there.
Yeah. We can't ever kind of quite fulfill the idea that newness comes about. Originality is some other source for something. Any other thoughts? I think it's particularly. I thought when I originally made the list, I thought there's something timely about spectrality in today's context. I've not quite fully worked it out yet, but I think it's something to do with. I mean, yesterday there was the announcement that the social care home deaths were illegal deaths, and something like 20,000 people died as a result of a kind of misshapen policy of not testing. As if that can just happen casually. The carelessness of life, and we're haunted by that.
Well, carelessness and then lying about it.
Or lying. It's as if the indexicality of truth has disappeared. So a lot of the issues were to do with indexicality, the disappearance of indexicality, that seeing is believing.
Jonathan, could you also just give me the reference again for that Japanese Potter film, the Ugetsu? What was the title of that film?
Oh, it's Ugetsu Monogatari. Ugestu Monogatari. Mono Gatari.
Great.
In the library. It's from the early 50s.
Brilliant.
And it's a very slow film, but it's a beautiful study in the life of a potter, but it's also about hauntology and war. It's very timely.
Yeah, it feels like it.
He's one of the great filmmakers of particularly he was working in the 50s, before the war and after the war.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the greatest filmmakers of that period.
Brilliant.
The scenes where he's in the haunted house are amazing, because there's sound. It's indicated by sound. There's a bell which goes off, and you realise it's not a normal situation. It's this rhythmical sound of the bell, which is kind of like it's haunted. And there's a mask which starts to talk on the wall. It's an ancestor.
Oh, wow. It sounds fascinating. I'm also fascinated too by this idea that you brought up about Freud as well, and this processing of grief, and how, well, actually, I think it was in the video, was it, about processing and whether we've done it properly or we haven't done it, and then how that resides inside us.
A culture that doesn't know how to deal with the dead is a culture in trouble.
Mm. And as you say, at the moment, where we're putting people in mass graves and we're not processing that properly. Seems very tight.
Economy. There's no symbolic. So in most wars, there's a return of the dead. There's an agreement afterwards that the bodies will be returned, and
But thank you for the lecture.
I didn't know how it was a bit longer. I cut it down. I was sort of looking for film clips till quite late. What do you think of the film clip of Derrida? I was particularly affected by the Kafka story. It was very good.
I thought it was good. It just gives a different viewpoint and adds some different color to the lecture. So yeah, I think film clips and the music is all good.
Yeah.
Comes at you from a different register.
The Japan, the song Ghosts is really interesting because it's almost atemporal. It doesn't develop. It doesn't. There's no time within it. So bereft of time. It floats. It circulates around itself, but it doesn't really. Sort of. You're always in the middle of something. Never. There's not a before and afterwards in it. Sort of 80s, but it's kind of quite unusual for a pop song to have that quality to it. And I thought Velvet Underground was just spooky. Real nighttime reverie, the dark side. Next week is on the Sublime. So again, it's sort of 100 slides. So it's quite a portrait of the Sublime. So it's going to be this term. There's going to be something on the object, imagination, the sublime, and done something on technology. And the final one, which is just sort of meditation on what we've done already, kind of summary. Any last questions? Any last thoughts on anything?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for all the time that you're putting into this. Really appreciate it.
Any last thoughts? Okay, we'll wind it up and let's